Disappointment, thy name is 6th Gen. Intro start. Yo, what's up guys, the Insane Game Freak here to bring you another video, and we're going to talk about 6th Generation and the disappointment it feels like it is. So, for those who don't know, recently, Pokemon Sun and Moon were recently announced, and it's pretty obvious just based on the title of the games that this is the next generation. This is 7th Gen, which means we're out of Kalos and going into a new region. And while it's not really too much to be excited for, well, let me rephrase that. There's excitement there, but it's kind of dampened by a few different things. A lot of people are dampened by the fact that we didn't see any footage of Gen 7, which I will say this is probably the most surprising because this is like one of the only generations I think that was ever announced where we didn't see anything for it. Like Gen 6, we saw gameplay footage, some of the actual Kalos region, and all the legendaries. We haven't seen jack shit except for a fucking digital design of Gen 7 Pokemon and some fucking concept art, which is very interesting because they've never been really that secretive about a Pokemon main series game. Like, I don't remember Gen 2, 3, 4, or 5 being like this at all. They at least showed different aspects of it. This is probably the weirdest type of announcement, which means, and the fact that this game is coming out in holiday 2016, which isn't really surprising. Pokemon games will usually come out near the latter half of the year, and it's another worldwide release, which is interesting considering they didn't do that with Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, if I remember correctly. They only did that with X and Y, and now the Chinese can speak. But with all this announcement of Gen 7 and the hypeness for Gen 7 based off of a digital 3D rendering of the new bird Pokemon, which a lot of people have coined, it looks like a woodpecker, so we might be getting our new bird might be a woodpecker variant. It kind of brings up the question, so Gen 6 is over after only like 2 games? Like, literally you had one mainline game and one remake, and that's all it got, versus every other generation that at the very least got got like the first version and then like the second version, usually in the form of like Emerald, Platinum, Crystal, actually I think that's it, Yellow version, and for whatever reason Gen 6 is just fucking, it's just X and Y and Oris. And if that really is what it is, and that's what it seems like, is that Gen 6 is done, that is kind of fucking depressing, primarily due to the fact that, well, Gen 6, I wouldn't say it was amazing out the gate. And that's probably part of the problem, is that Gen 6 didn't really capture people like it was supposed to. Let me rephrase that. I think the old school fan who barely ever played any of the newer games were probably happy with Gen 6. But as someone who's into like the Pokemon lore and has followed every single game, Gen 6 seems pretty lackluster in a lot of different areas. It's kind of like you got the 3D world down, you got the aesthetic, and then like the Pokemon listing was low, the gym leaders aren't that interesting, the league was easy as, the game as a whole is easy as fuck, and then some of the technical issues, like how even though you could move in 3D, you're still stuck to like the 8-directional plane, which they kind of fixed in Oris. And then like, the slowdown during the battles, you couldn't barely turn on the 3D, which was ironic for the game. Like the game it's kind of like, to me it reminds me of Diamond and Pearl in that way, where it seems like it has a lot of small changes that'll mean more over the course of the series. But like as far as that generation in itself, disappointing as fuck. Because to me, Gen 4 up until this point was probably the most disappointing gen, which now I would say Gen 6 is probably the most disappointing. Because it feels like they kind of just, it feels like this generation only exists to transition them to 3D, and they were like, this is going to be a testing ground generation, and then we're going to actually move on with Gen 7, and Gen 7 is going to be the real shit. And I'm just like, oh, that just seems weak. The region itself, although I don't think is bad, isn't insanely interesting. It feels like they hit the apex of how much they could do with 2D shit in terms of like Gen 5. Gen 5, I would argue, is the best best pre 3D era Pokemon game. Like, I can't think of any other game from Gen 5 and back that can touch Gen 5 as an overall as an overall generation. Gen 5 is the best. That's my opinion. Granted, I still like Gen 3 and I appreciate what Gen 3 has, but I can openly admit that Gen 5 overall is a better generation, although I still have a love for Gen 3. And Gen 6 has a remake of Gen 3 in it. It's just that the remake of Gen 3 feels lackluster to the original. Like, think about it. This thing, because ORAS doesn't have we don't have a battle frontier, like, at all. And I don't get that. Like, it feels like ORAS is a remake that took shit out while having new shit in there, and the new shit just felt like, oh, well, we're sorry we took out the battle frontier, so here's some extra shit. Like, Gen 6 feels so weak. And it disappoints me. Like, Gen 6 is probably the only generation I sat there and thought, this is the generation that really does need that third version. Because when it came to fucking Diamond and Pearl and Platinum, granted, well, no, that's not a good example, because Platinum fixed a good amount of the problems Diamond and Pearl had, specifically with how slow the fucking game ran. Which was also just a result of transitioning from the Game Boy Advance to the DS, but that's a different story. It felt like Gen 6 doesn't feel as special to me. Like, it really feels like it was just meant as a transitioning generation, and like the real shit starts now. And I'm like, well, that's disappointing to me. Like, am I the only one who feels that way? Like, I was excited to hear about an ORAS remake, Omega Ruby, Alpha Sapphire, and then I got the games and I was like, wow, why am I so underwhelmed by this? And it's not against the quality of the games, because for Gen 3 remakes, for the most part, they're better, except for the fact that if you want to play the Battle Frontier, you gotta go back and play the original version. Like, it's not as definitive as it was for Silver's remakes, Silver and Gold's remakes, or Red, Blue, and Yellow's remakes, where it's like there is no motherfucking reason to go back to the old version. Like, at all. There is absolutely. Fire Red, Leaf Green, and Heart Gold and Soul Silver are so much fucking better, it makes no sense to go back to the old versions, versus Ruby and Sapphire, where I can still argue you could probably go back to the old ones and have just as much fun, if not more fun with it, because it takes up some of the dumb traits from fucking Gen 6, where it's like, Ruby and Sapphire to me, next to maybe like Diamond and Pearl, were like the last really hard Pokemon games. Gen 5 isn't what I would call a cakewalk, but it's obviously easier than the other generations. When you add in, Gen 6's change to the experience share, the fact that whatever reason Gen 6 seems to have a fucking thing about giving you free megas for no goddamn reason, it makes the game a cakewalk, and I'm like, why did you do that? Like, now obviously most people tell me, well, you don't have to use those features, but to me, it was the fact that they're there and the fact that they're so readily available. Like, the game, I think with the Latios and Latias thing, you have no choice. You gotta take them anyway. Same thing with the Lucario and Lapras thing. It's like, son, why are you giving me free Pokemon? It's retarded. And so, like, Gen 6 felt really underwhelming because the gym leaders were fucking weak. The league was weak. The villains aren't terrible, but I can see why people think they're weak. But they are weaker. They are weaker than Team Plasma in almost every fucking way. Which was such a shame, because I was so hyped just based off of their looks. I thought they were probably the more interesting looking team. And granted, some of the very little post-game stuff in X and Y got me interested, and I heard about the stuff in ORAS. And I'm like, there's stuff there, but it just feels like it's so minuscule to the other games. Especially Gen 5 had a retarded amount of shit to do in the post-game. Like, when you look at Gen 5's post-game and then you compare it to Gen 6's, it's like, son, what happened? It's like, to me, it literally feels like they moved right into a new fucking console system and they just said, we're going to do the bare minimum and just try to figure this shit out. Like, I really feel like Gen 6 at this point in time feels like it was just a transitioning generation. The generation that really didn't mean much other than to get them on the 3DS and to get them familiar with the 3DS so they can jump right into the real meat and potatoes game, which will probably be Gen 7. And that, to me, if anything, that means you should be hyped for Gen 7, because Gen 7 should fix about every problem when Gen 6 had. And Gen 6's problem is that it felt like it kind of felt like a cash grab in that sense. It felt like it was a generation where they did some changes. Because I'm not trying to knock the shit that they did. I'm just saying when you look at Gen 5, next to it, it's like, son, it feels like Gen 6 is like Gen 1 in that aspect. When you look at it's like comparing Gen 1 and Gen 5 is like comparing Gen 5 and Gen 6. Which is retarded considering Gen 6 is the newer generation. It feels lacking. And like almost in every sense of the word, Gen 6 feels lacking. It's not a terrible generation, but it's a disappointing generation. I can still go with, I sunk in a lot of hours in X and Y and Norris. But my point is, in comparison to other Pokemon games, it's gotta be the weakest. It's probably the least technically flawed, except for the stupid, well no, it's flawed. I guess, I don't know how to phrase this. It's the most up to date, so it's the most accessible generation. To me, actually, this would be Gen 6 would be the generation I would recommend newbies start with. If you're someone who hasn't played Pokemon since like Generation 1, start with Gen 6. Because Gen 6 is so retardedly easy that everything else is gonna look hard as fuck to you. Like Gen 6 is such a newbie-friendly generation. That's what I would call it. That's literally what I would call it. It's a newbie-friendly generation that did the bare minimum in terms of like everything. Because as I said, I don't want to repeat myself, but am I the only one who feels like that? I feel like it's kind of hard to get excited for Gen 7 when Gen 6 was so disappointing. Like, you can't get me hyped for Gen 7 off of a disappointing generation. And it's not like Gen 4, where Gen 4, although it was disappointing, it was more just because the game was more boring than anything. I could still see the merits in Gen 4. I could see what they did in Gen 4. It's not that same type of disappointment. Because Gen 4's was just a lot of dumbass missteps, whereas in Gen 6 it feels like they just did the bare minimum. Like, I'll put it this way, Gen 4 doesn't seem like it's from a lack of effort. Gen 4 just seems like misplaced effort. Versus like Gen 6, it feels like a lack of effort. And to me, that's worse. Because at least with Gen 4, you were still putting in a good amount of effort. Because I don't hate on Gen 4 because saying it's a terrible generation. I think it's the next to Gen... Well, see, I still think it's the worst generation as an overall package. In terms of the... Oh, I guess that's not fair either, because Gen 1 is the most technically flawed. I guess I would say, in terms of the way the generations came out, Gen 4 was the most disappointing. Going from Gen 3 to Gen 4 is the most disappointing. In like small ways. Whereas Gen 6 just is disappointing on like, it's almost the opposite. It feels like the more they cater to the hardcore metagame Pokemon phase, the less the kind of, I wouldn't even say casual fan, but the less the dedicated fan gets hyped for. Because there's like barely any lore in Gen 6. Gen 6 has like barely any lore. The Mega Evolution thing is unbalanced. I don't give a fuck if most people tell you it's unbalanced. You really can't really win fights without using Megas. That shouldn't be a thing. That shit needs to be retooled, period. I don't fucking hate Mega Evolutions like I know some people do, but it does need to be rebalanced. Because it's an interesting battle mechanic, but the fact that only certain Pokemon have them, and then the ones that have them are Pokemon that were already overly strong to begin with, it gets fucking ridiculous. It's like, I don't know, man. That's just my thoughts and opinions on it. It's like, am I excited for Sun and Moon? Yeah, but it's like cautiously excited. Because looking at Gen 6, if it's a continuation of Gen 6, that means it's pretty much starting over. It's like we're just going back to, this will be the Johto version of fucking, for Gen 7 will be the Johto to Gen 6. Which granted, Johto was pretty legit, but it's just fucking disappointing. It's like, and I'm not such a stickler for the Pokemon roster, but it's like everything else just felt weak. If there was more lore, and granted, Gen 7, from the little tidbits we got, based on some of the designs for the Pokemon centers, and the ambulance, and the fire truck, and the fucking tropical setting, a lot of people are saying this game is based in, it's going to be taking its base from like Singapore and shit. Like, the game has the potential, and it looks like it's going to be trying to push itself further to kind of make up for the ridiculousness and disappointment that is Gen 6. But that doesn't help Gen 6. I'm still looking at Gen 6 going, man, you could have been so much better. And Gen 7 is just going to make it feel worse. But I don't hate Gen 6. Like Gen 4, I can't go back and replay. That's the one thing I'll give Gen 6. Gen 6 is replayable. Gen 4 is actually aggravatingly unplayable. It's not like, fuck you, but it's borderline like, fuck you, I don't ever want to play this game again. Gen 6 is just too fucking easy. It's too easy and boring because of it. Because let's be honest, Gen 6 is the easiest generation to play. It is the absolute easiest generation of Pokemon games you can play. And that's just a fucking fact. And it sucks because there's a lot of cool shit in Gen 6. Gen 6 has good shit in it. It's just not fully realized. That's probably the biggest disappointment. It's not a fully realized generation in terms of its remakes or its main games. Fuck. Because I think a Pokemon Z would have helped out Oris. It would have helped out X and Y. But then that's not what they decided to do. It's kind of obvious. It was a transition generation. Disappointing, but you know, that's just me. But tell me your thoughts and comments in the comment section below. This has been the Insane Game Freak. Life's a game, play to win, and I will catch you guys later. Peace off.